Now, my name is Sonia Antel. I'm not going to have my video on today, but I will just say hello. Hi, folks, just to show you who I am. Some of you I know we've met, some of us haven't met. We don't have the video on because it doesn't help with bandwidth really, and we want this to be a successful event. But thank you everyone for joining us and giving time today. This is one of a series of webinars, and I've just got a few words by means of housekeeping, if you like. I've got some colleagues whose names you will have seen while you could see me with me. Julie and Klaus are going to help with any tech questions you've got. So feel free to put those in the chat function. You know, I don't know, you can't hear me. Well, nobody can see me, but you can't hear me, or whatever you need to say to us, that would be useful, or hello for that matter. There will be some time at the end for questions. I won't talk for the whole 45 minutes. I'll talk for, I don't know, 20 or thereabouts. I'll be really happy to take your questions. So feel free to put the questions in the Q&A, and I'll answer as many as I can. And for those of you who are regulars, you'll know the recording will be sent to everybody within a couple of days of the webinar. I think it has to be edited or something technical. And it's also on the website, so in a couple of days again, so that you can send it, view it later, or get colleagues to look at it, or refer it to others or whatever. And the second thing, so as people know, is this is one of a series of webinars. We've been doing them for some time, but very consistently through lockdown, to do with virtual working, facilitating virtually, managing change, and the like. And where we get our ideas for webinars are a lot according to what people who attend are saying to us. So if you've got ideas, thoughts, or needs for other topics, feel free to stick them in the chat function, and they'll kind of, inform part of our thinking. Anyway, that's enough by way of setup. So I'm going to start the webinar. Oh, hold on. I'm going to start the webinar now. Here we are. So I want to talk a bit about the impact of change on individuals. We've all got a vast amount of experience at the moment, but a concept that many of you will be familiar with. So just to remind you about that. What we can do as managers and leaders to support people through change, and the place of resilience. And then I've got some examples about how action learning can help teams and organisations engage with the challenges around change. So that's the agenda. I think I've got about 8 slides. So this is the change curve. Well, many of you will have seen it and be very familiar with it. And where it comes from, it was originally developed by Elizabeth Kubler Ross, who was, I think, a psychiatrist and a psychiatric nurse, I can't remember exactly. And it came from her really extensive research into bereavement. It was originally called the grief curve, I think, or the loss curve. And since then, its applicability to any change situation has become really, really apparent. And it's been adapted and looked at and thought about in terms of, individual change. If we think of our experience over these recent months, and change with teams and change with organisations. And very simply, there's 4 stages, if you like, and you can see them here in the bands on the slide. So the first change is shock or denial. I certainly remember waking up on those late days in March thinking, this just cannot be for real. It just cannot be for real. I can't believe I'm living through this. And the second stage is we get over that kind of shock, that denial, this can't be true. And we get over that and we move into something like anger, resistance, kind of frustration. I don't want it to be true. It can't be true. It shouldn't be true. It won't be, how can I stop it, change it, those kinds of things. And somewhere down there's the bottom of the curve. And sooner or later that shifts and we begin very slowly a kind of process of acceptance. But before we get to the top of the other end of the curve, there's a whole lot of stuff around what's this really like? What can I do? What can't I do? If I think back to March and April, what does it feel like to try and get to the shops for myself? How am I going to engage with this? And ultimately, people accept change and integrate it. Now, I've been talking just now about our recent 6 months, but this is true for any organisational change, any personal change, and it has real kind of consequences for managers and leaders managing the process. So, supporting people through change, people will go through every part of that curve. They might do it quickly, or it might take a lifetime. And the change curve does work at an individual and a team and an organisational level. Or we could say a family level and look back, at what's been happening recently. Critically for managers and for leaders, individuals will vary the speed at which they go through it. And that means they'll need different supports at different times. And it's also very, very possible to get stuck in one place. It's very, very possible. It's also important to know, while we draw it, while it's drawn as a kind of graph with a downward curve and an upward trajectory, it's not a linear process. It's an emotional process. It's a psychological process. And that means people will go back and forth. And you'll see that if you think of a large organisational change programme, or if any of you are involved in what's happening in many organisations now, where positions are being cut, services are being rationalised, all of those kinds of really drastic things that are happening in organisations as a result of the challenges of the virus. You'll find people are in denial, become angry, move into acceptance. Something happens and they slip back to fury. How could this be real? How could this just be the case? I was walking last night with a friend who works in the NHS, who'd actually was kind of well up into the integration part of the curve, as was her team. And she told me a rather sad story that the people who had been working at home, when they came back into the service, they were given welcome packs, welcome back. And what that did for the people who'd come into the service throughout, they were describing it as a complete kick in the teeth. And they're very angry and hurt. So in a way, they'd slip back as a result of that kind of intervention. So to reach acceptance, to get through to the end of the curve or the other side of the curve, you have to let go of the way things have been done, whatever that was, whatever that has been. And one of the ways to do that is look at what you can control and what you can influence. And I'll talk about that briefly. And critically, although we've kind of got negative change in our mind at the moment, loss around what we can do socially and emotionally with the virus, the changes in the economy and the work situation, even when change is positive, you'll still go through the change curve. People get the job they wanted, the promotion they wanted, move to the country or buy the house they want, or whatever it is, you still go through the change curve. So what can managers and leaders do for people, for their teams, for their peers, for their colleagues? It's critical in the first instance to make some kind of assessment or judgment, because different people will need different things according to where they are. At the very first stage, at the shock denial, it can't be real stage, people need communication and information and space and opportunity to be listened to. They just need to be listened to. The next stage is actually a really tough one for managers, because they can often be the target of the resistance and the anger. There's no reorganisation or restructure where people who are at the end of that say it was done well. Universally, people will say those things are done badly. So at the resistance and anger stage, again, communication and support is required, as well as real recognition and validation of how hard the situation is. It doesn't work to just be encouraging and positive. There's something about really validating how hard it is if your colleagues are losing their jobs or having their hours cut, being made to work in ways they're finding difficult, or whatever's happening. At the next stage, where people start engaging with the change in a different way and start exploring, It's called developing hopeful kind of realism. People need encouragement, they need support. What's working for you? What was it like to do that? How did you get on? What would help you? What would help your team? And finally, kind of validation and recognition that people got through something that was really difficult to deal with. So those are the kinds of things that managers can do for their teams and for their colleagues going through change. A practice or a tool, if you like, that can really help around change is considering Stephen Covey's circles of influence. And this comes from the Habits of 7 Effective Managers, I think the book is called, forgive me, can't remember the exact title. People will have seen this, I'm sure, people will know it. And it's usually brought to life best by an example. So one of the first times I used this was in an inner London hospital, certainly pre-COVID, in the A&E department, where morale and working practices and all sorts were really low. We did a massive brainstorm, and as many as the staff as we could get hold of. You know, what are all the things that get in the way of you doing your work? You know, whether you're a nurse or a ward sister or an auxiliary, what are all the things that get in the way of you doing your job? Sadly, we went over flip chart papers and covered the staff room wall with stuff. And we then went back, we got a cup of coffee, and we went back and we categorized it. And we categorized this stuff, this input, these really real things, according to Covey's circles of influence. So in the very center of the circle, I think you can see my cursor there in the darker gray crosshatch. Those are things I can, for instance, or a nurse or a staff member can directly influence. They are in my control. And we went through this material and we categorized what are the things that are in my control as somebody who's on the night shift on a Friday night or the day shift Saturday morning or whatever. Moving out, what are the things here that I can't control but I could influence? I could band together with colleagues and make representations to the managers. I could consult and see if people want to make this change or look at what exactly we need, make a case for whatever the change might be. I could have a voice. I could have a voice and I could have some influence. And what are the things in this outer circle here that I, as a night nurse on a Friday night in an inner London hospital, can do nothing about? So we categorise these things. And in here, in the middle circle, there was stuff like, if I'm using a locker that's meant to be for my shift, what I can do is clear my locker at the end of my shift and take my yoga kit or whatever home, or my shopping home, so that my colleague who shares the locker with me can leave their stuff in a locker for their shift and hasn't got the added stress of working on A&E and carrying around their purse and their backpack or whatever. So there's some really simple, practical things I can do that will make a difference to others. And it also means then the locker's free for me. And then there's stuff that people had to band together. So for example, one of the complaints was, there was a very small supplies cupboard in this massive A&E department, tiny cupboard, probably looks much like anyone's kind of medical cupboard at home. And yet people were seeing huge numbers, nurses were seeing huge numbers of, injuries and cuts and bruises and things that needed dressing. And together they made representations to the ward sister and the manager. We need supplies, we need literally, bandages and injections and anesthetics, small anesthetics and steri strips and so on. We need that stuff locally. We need somebody to build a cupboard, and we need to not have to walk, 3/4 of a mile and use a sign-out procedure to get steri strips on at 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning, because that would reduce wait times, and we could get that changed. But if one of the things that's going on is actually I am really deeply unhappy about working in an A&E department in an inner London hospital, I find it too unsafe or too threatening or too busy, then actually there's nothing we can do about that, and that's about either acceptance or radical change. So this is just a mechanism that can help people or help managers kind of have one way through helping others with change. Okay. And there's a lot of talk now about resilience as a way to help people change. This is the kind of one of the classic definitions that we use. And it's a process of adapting well in the face of threats or significant sources of stress. And it literally means bouncing back from difficult experiences. And I couldn't get this to work, but in fact, that is actually a graphic where the tennis ball bounces to kind of live up to this image. There's lots and lots of work on resilience. So I won't go into it, but I'll just show you we'll look at something. This is work that was developed by Robertson and Dr. Gary Cooper, and they categorized 4 areas where things can really, really make a difference to people in terms of resilience and in terms of coping with change. And these are good things for managers to have in mind, or even have a discussion or a team meeting about. One of the things I think managers can possibly do something about is an issue about purposefulness. Why are these changes happening at work? How is it going to better serve the beneficiaries? How is it going to better serve the organisation, or whatever's the issue? So a sense of purpose and the value of drive, and those kinds of things can help you persist in the face of setback. Now, obviously, there's a fundamental issue here if somebody completely disagrees with the purpose of something, but overall, that can really make a difference. Confidence, in terms of being competent in coping with stressful situations, and strong self-esteem, that's, to an extent, that's a personal quality, but really good line management and really good feedback culture can make a difference there. People at work can really lose sense with what they're doing well, and just get caught up with, well, that didn't go well today and that didn't go well, and yet 95% of their job is they're doing incredibly well. So good line management culture can really help with helping people have a good perspective in terms of how they're doing at work, and that can contribute to confidence. Social support, we know a lot about. We've heard a lot about how important that's been during COVID times. And adaptability here, in the purple bubble. Adaptability, again, it's a personal piece, but managers can make a difference here. Around flexibility, around taking ideas, around hearing contributions from people. So they're just some thoughts about resilience. When we unpick those, the things we do in action learning can really make a contribution to people, both developing resilience and becoming engaged with the challenges of change in a positive way. So action learning sets help people make connection amongst your peer group, and that links back to the social support we spoke about. Helps people see crises as well, it may be a crisis, but see them, within a framework. And there's things to do with accepting that change is actually given. We've had a radical amount of change at the moment, but in fact, the world is always changing. Action learning is particularly good around helping people with opportunities for self-discovery and self-insight, and for things like taking care of yourself. A good action learning set is often called the support and a challenge group. And the support is about really, profoundly being understood and listened to. And then the challenge is about taking action in a kind of engaged and positive way. So action learning can be a really useful tool in terms of being engaged with change and developing resilience. And I've got some examples I want to give now where we've used action learning in action learning in change situations. And then I think I'm going to flip forward. Yes, then I'll get onto Q&A. I'll be really, really happy to get your questions. So right now, the Clause Social Foundation is running a Leading Beyond Lockdown programme, made available to leaders in the social sector, and we're running a vast amount. I think we're running 32 action learning sets for leaders in the social sector, often chief execs or senior people in other organisations. And it's about how do you lead your teams, your organisations, who are serving people in real need at the moment, given all that's happening with, with lockdown. And, this said beyond lockdown last week, and now in some places that actually is, through lockdown for a second time. An older example, we did some work a couple of years ago with a global printing company, which was fortunate enough to never have had any restructuring or ever had any kind of redundancies, but now was making them. And we had a pretty unusual action learning set, in that the set was made up of the managers whose services were being outsourced to India. And there was a consultation process, there was a legal process, HR were involved, and alongside the process that the managers were going through, we ran action learning sets to help them engage with that material, engage with what it felt like, explore specific challenges for people. And afterwards they said, I mean, obviously they couldn't have gone through the restructuring without following process correctly. They actually said the most helpful piece was the action learning set. We've done lots of examples in mergers, and an example I can give is, it's a while ago now, but Cancer Research UK, in the interest of times, I'll just do this one. Cancer Research UK is made up of what was the two largest cancer charities in the UK. The one was ICRF, which I think was the fundraising, sort of awareness raising charity primarily. And the other was the Cancer Research Campaign, which had lots of premises, well, still has lots of premises up in Cambridgeshire. And that was much more to do with, researching cure, treatment, interventions, scientific work. And the two charities merged into what we now know as Cancer Research UK. They had different cultures, they had different ways of working. We ran a massive action learning program to support that, where sets were made up from people from both charities. And what they did was help each other work on real life problems, but also get to know each other's work and understand the value and the need. It was really useful work with fundraisers better understanding what medics and scientists are doing, and likewise scientists better understanding, how to use their work to raise awareness and motivate people to raise funds. So that was a great piece of work. And right now, and sorry, these examples are slightly out of order. The CLAW we're doing right now, and the ALNAP work we're doing right now. And ALNAP is a partnership of a global network of NGOs and academics and practitioners of refugee type organisations. And the aim of the work is to develop the capacity of NGOs using action learning in field situations. So that's in humanitarian situations, maybe war, maybe natural disaster. And the purpose of these sets is to improve the response effectiveness in humanitarian crises. And if you think of what's going on in the world now with COVID, there cannot be a sort of more important time to be doing this work. So that's just another example of using action learning to engage with change. So I'm going to move into questions. I'm sorry I've been talking a lot. It does always feel like I'm talking a lot when you do these things. I think I've got one example that people have given me, and I'm going to come to the Q&A section. And my colleague Ruth may have collected other questions. And I should say, if we don't get to all the questions, what we do is collect them when we save the webinar, and they often influence what we do next. So a question that came in early from someone who got the invitation, I'm sorry, I can't remember who. Somebody said to us, or said to me, how do you ensure people are involved and contribute to a change program and not just resist? And you can't ensure that, but if you make pockets and areas of support and development available to people, so for example, action learning sets, and if you plan those to get input from people or to provide input, it may be that you can get learning loops coming out where there's things in that those sets could tell the organisation about how they could better manage change. And that kind of dialogue throughout an organisation, it may be bottom up, top down, but it may simply be throughout. Those kinds of things can make a difference. And making space for people to connect, connect through change, can mean people can be supported, have a kind of metaphorical shoulder to cry on, and have colleagues say, well, how are you doing it? What's it like to get rid of people? How are you managing? How are you sleeping at night? So those kinds of things can help. Now, Ruth, I don't know if you've got particular questions you'd offer, any particular question you think I should take.
There's one that's appeared in the chat screen.
Yeah.
If people put their questions in the Q&A, but the chat screen, there's a question from Sarah. Have we applied action learning principles and processes to facilitate change without actually running an action learning set?
I know, that's kind of interesting. What's your thought there, Ruth?
I was trying to think that sometimes we run one-off events. So we might be invited in to talk to a team or to run a workshop, and we do bring action learning principles to that, even though you wouldn't say that it's an action learning set because it's not continuing over a period of time and it wouldn't necessarily be peers. But the principles of giving each other space, listening to each other, asking questions, getting individuals and teams to formulate their action would underlie any work we do in a change program.
Actually, the example that comes to mind is we did do a large event not so very long ago, the Atlantic Fellowship in Oxford, a weekend event. And we supplied, I think it was about 10 facilitators to a massive event, which had an overall structure. And we did small group work with people using the action learning principles where they were listening to each other, but it wasn't a series of action learning sets. So I don't know who asked that question, but I'd say undoubtedly yes is the answer. It's the short answer.
Ask that. And Charlie Hay says, can you do action learning with people who are not peers? For example, a manager and their line manager.
Oh, okay. Hi, Charlie. It's very good to hear from you. Great that you're here. We don't, classically, that's not how action learning is set up. Having said that, when we do our action learning facilitator training, really very often when we work in-house, we'll have a line manager, for instance, and their whole team, and we work out ground rules in terms of how people behave, what's acceptable, what's somebody's role. Am I here as an action learning facilitator? Am I here as your line manager? How many hats are we wearing, or which hat am I wearing at which time? So while it's not a classic approach, it can be done, and we have got experience doing it. And it's about absolute clear contracting. It's about absolute clear contracting in the first place, and honesty, and then assessment of what's available in that situation as well. I think it is also helpful. Yeah, an assessment of what's helpful in that situation. So short answer. Okay. What else would be a good question that's come up, Ruth?
Again, in the chat screen, we've got some appearing in the Q&A now, so we can come to those in a minute. But Ian Mitchell is asking something that, I'm sure we've experienced this. People adjust to change at different rates. What can be done to not allow the most resistant to
That is such a good question, Ian. And I have to say, we engage with that question so often around our facilitator training especially. There's some kind of principles we use in action learning that help, because it's also important not to have the most resistant or most distressed person closed down. So if in action learning sets you do things as we'd call it in a round, everybody speaks in turn, and everybody gets listened to. So it's not a discussion. It's not a kind of ping pong discussion. It's not you've sparked my idea or whatever. It's, for instance, Ian speaks and Sonia speaks and Ruth speaks and so on and so on. And we just listen. That can be quite an equalizing kind of mechanism. So somebody can say that they're resistant and someone else can say that it's working better for them. And as long as everybody is heard in those ways, that can make a real real difference. And then I think the other piece that comes to mind is ground rules, and the principle of which we do have in action learning, the principle of people taking responsibility for their material, their issues, and their situation. I have seen situations where somebody gets very distressed or angry on behalf of another participant, and we get people to hold back on that because we're focusing on a particular issue for a presenter. So you can't guarantee it, but there are things you can do to facilitate it being heard without it dominating. I think is probably about the best you can do. Yeah. Okay. It might be that there's mechanisms in an action learning program, while it's largely confidential, there's often in some change programs that we work on, there's mechanisms whereby we collect feedback from the group and feed it into the team managers, for instance. And if I think of the example with the printing organisation I gave, we had a mechanism. So at the end of the third and the sixth set, the commissioning managers who paid for us to go in and do that work, came in at half an hour before the end of the set. And the set spent the half an hour before saying, what do we want to say collectively to these people? What's helping, what isn't helping, what could they do for us? And knowing that those avenues can be there and people will be heard, those things can also help. And it can help the most resistant, sorry Ruth, I'll let you go in a moment. It can help the most resistant or distressed person to hear other people's copings, coping mechanisms or resilience. That can also shift someone's perspective. But I'm very pleased if you've got something to offer here, Ruth.
No, it wasn't that at all. It's that more questions are pouring in, so I didn't want
you. Okay.
Okay, so there's a short one, which is how long does a typical action learning set take? And
okay.
Then, are you always explicit about the purpose? For example, Janet asks, could you present it as the purpose being problem solving, but you've got a subtext of getting people from different parts of the organisation, possibly where there's conflict, get to know each other? And
okay. So I can only do 2 questions at a time.
Okay, and then there's more.
All right, I believe you. So how long is an action learning set? I'm assuming you mean a set. I don't know if you mean a set or a series. Virtually, which is what we're doing at the moment, a set is usually 3.5 hours, and a series of action learning sets is usually 6 meetings. Sometimes they're face-to-face. When they're face-to-face, we've often done a full day to start with, but we don't do that online. That's the short one. I think you said it was Janet's question was the second.
Yes.
My general practice would be, why not be explicit and upfront with people if one of the things you want them to do is meet others in the organisation? What people are adults at work, we're not children that need to be motivated to learn or engage at school or whatever. We're adults, and my approach would be to be explicit and straightforward about what's in it for the attendee, the participant, and what's in it for the organisation.
Thank you. And someone asks, action learning is often used as a form of peer learning and support. How effective is it for intact teams, especially as this is when they need help to manage the change together?
It is effective with intact teams, but it is the most demanding application. So I have to be really straightforward about that. It's the most demanding application, and it requires really clever contracting with the commissioner, whoever's getting you in, and a proper assessment of the team. There would be some teams we wouldn't do it for, and we've got, I think we've got 27 or 28 associates. We actually wouldn't get every associate to do that work. We would only put our most experienced people on that work. And that's because, wanting that breadth and depth of experience for what could be what is a challenging application.
And how do you create or capture organisational learning across a number of sets? Asks Janet O'Mahony.
Okay. Okay, well, you'd agree that up front, how you're going to do it, but the kinds of things we've done have across a number of sets. We recently did a big program with a beauty company, Covey, and what we did, I think, can't remember now if it's a set 3 and 6 or something like that, we asked them 2 specifically agreed open questions in advance. That what they were don't come to mind, but it was something like, you know, what would help you implement your learning in the organisation, or what's holding you back. Collected all this material exactly in the participants' words, fed it out to them, agreed it didn't identify anyone, and then sent it to whoever was interested in this material, whatever was the senior, you know, learning and development officer. So that's one mechanism. So there are mechanisms for doing that. I don't know if I know you've done a lot of that as well, Ruth. I don't know if you've got anything else to add, so do feel free to come in.
Yes, so you can create a whole organisational process for harvesting the learning, if you like, from different sets. So you might have a launch at the beginning where people talk about what they want to get out of action learning, and then they might come back together at the end. Sometimes that also includes some senior managers, so they have an opportunity to present their learning afterwards. I can think of a national charity, and this wasn't actually work that our company did, but somebody who came on facilitator training told me about it. I thought it was a brilliant way of doing it, that they were sufficiently large for them to have peer sets across the country, and then after each round of peer sets, some anonymized messages got fed into the senior management team. These are the challenges that your middle managers are currently working on. And it would only work where it could be anonymized and the senior managers aren't going to go, oh, well, we all know who said that, you know. So, but it worked brilliantly as a way of regularly feeding up the issues that were arising in action learning to the senior management team.
Yeah, yeah. It does need that careful planning up front. Yeah. So maybe 1 or 2 more questions before we close.
Laurie Smith is asking, is 2 or 3.5 or 3 or 3.5 hours too much? In his experience, it might be her, sorry, I don't know. 2 hours is the maximum limit online, and I would say we sometimes have done 2 hours. It's better if you can persuade people to do 3 hours, but you can do action learning in 2.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. But if you do 3.5 hours, you get more done. So yeah, we regularly do that. We've got all sorts of ways of getting people to be really engaged. People often say to us, oh heavens, 3.5 hours is so long, and then they say, good Lord, where did the time go? So we hear that regularly. So it can definitely be done. And we do shorter times when we get called to, don't we?
Yes, and I think we have to take account of the current environment that, you know, as with people today who are talking about spending 9 hours a day in Zoom meetings.
Yeah.
And so, you know, marking something out as action learning and saying this is different and you will feel differently about this time spent. It's not just another meeting, but
yes,
you know, when people are under that kind of pressure, then maybe it's an opportunity for a shorter session.
Yeah.
And
one more question then.
One more, which is a huge question, but it's you feel passionate about. Do you think there's an opportunity to use action learning for social change, given major global issues around race?
Oh heck.
Yeah, and we do, absolutely. So we've got a number of sets at the moment around climate change. So bringing global and international players together to talk about what they might do, how they can influence the system. And I think definitely about Black Lives Matter, we're just getting our heads around what Action Learning Associates might do to support that, and how we make sure that change happens at a significant level. It's not just cosmetic change. So I think there's really interesting ways learning can contribute to social change.
Yeah, that's most definitely the case. So I really want to thank everyone for you're giving us your time right now. You know, I'm very conscious that time's really valuable and people are already spending a long time online. This is just to let you know some stuff we've got coming up. We've got a course on change management coming up in October, and some virtual facilitator training. And as I said earlier, if you've got ideas or thoughts about future topics for webinars, we'd be very, very happy to hear them. And I'm conscious we didn't get to all the questions, so we will read them later. We'll read them when we've saved all the material. And it may well be that also informs what we do next. And I think now we've got a closing poll coming up. which I think talks about how you found this. And if you actually think you're going to use action learning in terms of managing your change in your organization, and you want to look at how we could work together, feel free to let us know, and we'll be in touch to have a conversation. But otherwise, I really appreciate people giving up your time right now. It's just really good of you, and you'll get the recording in a couple of days. So that's the end of the webinar. I'll leave it open for a moment just to make sure we give people a chance for the poll. But thank you everybody, and goodbye.